So I have one thing to say and only one thing to say. Fucking Slayer! We need to start putting some more respect on Slayer's name than we actually do. Regardless of where they lie on your ranking of the big four of thrash metal, for me personally, they rank at number 2. I think that a lot of people, it kind of flies under the radar just how much influence Slayer had on multiple different things that in this video I'd like to go over with you guys, and I want to hear your opinions of Slayer, either from a musical or a personal department. How do you feel about them? How do you feel about them coming back? And just in general, do you like them or do you not? Thrash metal was the next logical step from speed metal when it burst on the scene. A lot of bands kind of played out in many ways as Motorhead worshippers, and most of the time the way that they approached songwriting wasn't that different than a lot of 70s speed metal, or took homage from early heavy metal music, sometimes Black Sabbath, but most notoriously bands like Iron Maiden as well as Judas Priest. But Motorhead definitely was the biggest catalyst for taking metal to the next level when it came to speed, aggression, intensity. And while there was a lot of sort of tampering with the style in the 1980s, no band encapsulated a lot of this as well as Slayer did. The 1980s was an interesting time for extreme music because it was around this time that in the metal sphere you had the development of death metal, of black metal, of grindcore, of gore grind, and so many different bands were testing the limits of just how far you could take heavy metal before it got too heavy or too aggressive or too raw. And an answer to this in many ways was thrash metal. It was much more of a commercially viable take on metal, similar to heavy metal, but was a little bit more aggressive. But compared to a lot of the extreme genres like death metal and black metal, a lot of the thrash metal bands of that day and age were a little bit more digestible than what you would get from the extreme music side of things. Within the big four of thrash metal, and even comparatively speaking to the German scene with bands like Tankard and Creator, Sodom, you saw Slayer taking things in a completely different direction. Now obviously the main part of this is their 1986 record, Rain in Blood, which is one of the crown jewels of not only thrash metal, but metal music in general. An incredible achievement in how you could take thrash metal to the absolute brink of intensity and edge and aggression, primality with a tenacious delivery, a production style that backed up its ferocity, and overall performances that were as technical as they were bust your head in heavy. This opened Slayer up to a brand new audience that they had never really touched before, because this was made via Rick Rubin, obviously, on Def Jam, which up until that point had pretty much only specialized in a lot of hip-hop music, soul, R&B. So having rock, let alone metal, let alone very heavy metal, was a very unheard of territory. Slayer's influence pierced into multiple different genres in ways that a lot of people don't give them a ton of credit for. A lot of times when you hear death metal brought up, you hear names like Morbid Angel, Possessed, Death. You'll hear King Diamond brought up as one of the big contributors to early black metal, as well as bands like Venom and Bathory and Celtic Frost. But the thing that a lot of people don't talk about is when you look at so many different extreme metal genres and some of the founding members and where they took their influence from, whereas a lot of black metal and especially early death metal took from early speed metal, you will hear Slayer's name brought up so much across the board in so many different genres as a massive influence for the heaviness, intensity, and specifically a lot of the imagery, a lot of the production, and a lot of the topic matters. Because one of the things that Slayer did that in general wasn't the biggest thing for heavy metal and speed metal at the time, I'm not going to say it was non-existent, but up until that point, heavy metal had been this creepy genre for the macabre, the Black Sabbath sort of take on eeriness and horror, and that was bleeding out into a lot of death metal and black metal. But Slayer was a massive key contributor to how imagery was used in metal music to sort of have this B-list horror sort of veneer to it. Slayer also showed that you didn't need to make a record super long for it to really have a lot of punch. Bands were starting to get a little bit longer, a little bit more ambitious with their song structures, with their album lengths, with their song lengths, but then you had Slayer busting out and having their best record pretty much being 29 minutes of material, and that was a very big deal that cannot be understated. And that's not even getting into some of the technicality and semantics of how they revolutionized in many ways how you approached heavy metal and thrash metal music. Dave Lombardo was such a big reason that double bass started to get used more and more in music, specifically extreme metal music, music and became such a staple and hallmark for extreme varieties of metal music. And honestly, Kerry King and Tom Araya will never not be legends in terms of how they approach guitar writing as well as vocalizations. They really did know how to pack a punch with intensity. And while there were bands that predated them that dealt with occult and horror, Slayer really sort of nailed that in, but they also took almost this sort of punk outlook on a lot of things. You didn't hear a lot of heavy metal music being the most political in the grand scheme of things, but here you had Slayer attacking things like organized religion, terrorism, fascism, putting so much heavy politicism in their music and having stances that were so aggressive and in your face and not afraid to just be there, and they didn't want to back down. So when you had this heavy metal band that was putting on the map things like racism and anti-war as well as politicism, and then simultaneously tackling heavy themes like religion and anti-religion, as well as all of these fun things like horror and B-list horror, serial killers, occult, if you just pay a little mind to the research of it, it's not hard to see why Slayer's influence had such a ripple effect across the entire metal landscape in such a sincere way that is still being felt to this day. It's why they kind of stick out like this sore thumb in the big four of thrash metal, with Metallica being all over the place and being a little bit more melodic, Anthrax being more signature speed metal Motorhead sort of worship, and Megadeth being a little bit more melodic but still heavy and kind of maintaining that old school sort of style. Slayer never let off the gas pedal when it came to their aggression, when it came to their technicality, but they never really gave a fuck about making their compositions super touched up or anything throughout their entire timeline, and that's something that's not only admirable but insanely influential to all the bands that were contemporary and all the bands that came after them. You know, I could keep ranting for a while, but I will leave it at that. But what are your guys' opinions of Slayer? You can let me know down in the comment section below. I can't wait to hear it. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is, my name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying, Slayer!